Hello, Bible readers. The done and done of Exodus 39 and 40 says that everything is ready, totally and perfectly ready to go. All that remains is the arrival of God's glory that will occupy the tabernacle. And so in the final paragraph of Exodus, we come upon our last pivotal scriptural moment in the book of Exodus. God had promised back in chapter 29, I will dwell among the Israelites. Well, now that dwelling is completed. Brueggemann says one can see that the priestly rhetoric of the text strains to affirm real presence without representing it as common or easily engaged presence, which is an interesting idea too, right? Like, is this idea of God's glory, as far as how accessible it is, how other is it? How common is it? How dangerous is this glory? And what we have to admit is that Exodus presents an understanding of glory that isn't just one thing. It's come up a bunch of different times in our posts, and it's not always the same thing. In chapter 14, verse 4, God seeks to gain glory over Pharaoh. Here, glory comes from a mighty victory. That's what glory is. In chapter 16, verses 7 to 10, Moses and the Israelites find God's glory to be present in the wilderness. Another example of dynamic glory. This glory is not constricted to a predictable place or time or way. It's going to have power where God chooses to have power. By chapter 24, the glory looks a lot different. It's become passive. It just is. And in just being, that is enough to redefine the life and faith of Israel, because that glory is among Israel. In chapter 33, Moses wants to access God's glory. And now one last word on God's glory here in chapter 40, a final pivotal passage. God's glory arrives in the tabernacle in a cloud. The reason Brueggemann wants to make a big deal of this final moment is because the different traditions that have presented glory so very differently, as sometimes God's glory is active and transformative, while within the priestly tradition it's passive and inaccessible. In this final form, the two traditions are taken together and they come to mean something very powerful. I'm already excited to tell you in just a minute, but God has gotten glory over Pharaoh and now will provide good governance, like an enthroned king. The priests here present God as one who will offer an abiding presence. Brueggemann wonders whether the priestly authors are again mirroring the creation accounts. They probably are, because those creation accounts always end with Sabbath, of course. And I just mean the two creation accounts, the one from the first and a little bit of the second chapter of Genesis, where on the seventh day God rests, but then also in chapters 25 to 31, it ends with God resting and suggesting Sabbath. Is this enthronement rest after all these divine victories? It's never stated that way. The word Sabbath isn't used, but it looks like that, right? God rests upon God's throne after achieving all this victory. One last point about this is very Exodus. Okay, it's a very Exodus point. It's going to take me a couple minutes to explain it well, so just bear with me. The priestly tradition writes this all up as though the arrival of the divine glory in the tabernacle is a permanent thing, right? God's real presence there among Israel is durable, it's uninterruptible. Praise be. That's the claim they're making. But they know better. They know better than that God will not be interrupted, that God's glory is going to just durably, always, forever remain among them. In 1 Samuel chapter 4, which recounts events that happened long before the priests of Babylon, the Babylonian exile, insert their stuff into Exodus. So in 1 Samuel, the story of the Ark of the Covenant, the icon of the divine presence being stolen, happens. Like, that ark was meant to put fear into Israel's enemies, and the enemy took it like a rival college's mascot. Brueggemann says that humiliating defeat led to a sad summary judgment, 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 21, where she named the child Ichabod. What does Ichabod mean? The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark had been captured. So we know, and the priests knew, and Israel knew, then, before, and after, that the glory of God can depart and did depart. Now, God will return with God's glory, of course, that'll happen, and it'll happen powerfully, even in the story of 1 Samuel. But the wound of glory departed lingers. The book of Ezekiel, too, recounts that God will not remain in a polluted city or in a defiled temple. In Ezekiel 43, he'll say that the exiled glory of God will in due course return to the temple in Jerusalem. But for as beautiful as Ezekiel's vision of the new Jerusalem, the restored Jerusalem is, Ezekiel too affirms that God's glory comes, but can also go. And then comes back, but then can also go again. In our Exodus text, something else is being claimed. The priests who wrote it saw and experienced one thing, but then claimed another. Why? Brueggemann believes they're being defiant. That's why I say it's a very Exodus thing to claim, because people of faith often are defiant. He says, I hazard the judgment that their presentation of uninterrupted glory in chapter 40, the kind that cannot be touched by Israel's deeds or misdeeds, cannot be affected by the ups and downs of history, their presentation of uninterrupted glory in chapter 40 is not at all an act of denial. It is rather an act of defiance. They will not give in to the dominance of empire that displaces or to the sadness that comes with abandonment. Claiming that God's glory is with us permanently is a refusal to give in to the rulers of this age. It holds deep conviction about the God who gained glory over Pharaoh and will gain glory again in more victories over powerful adversaries of our world. These priests, in my own words, it seems to me, are fools for God, much like Paul will talk about being a fool for Christ, much like you and I are fools for spending hours of diving deep into an ancient text about the God of some mixed multitude half a world away from 3,300 years ago. But they were delivered out of empire into covenant. And as fools in the faith of Jesus, we too believe that that work is still being done by that God, freeing us from empire into a relational covenant that binds us together and with that God forevermore. And so we keep on fooling around. We are one with our God. Our God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Exodus.